So, where do you expect to find poetry? In yourself. Where else? You write it out, it seems just great. You type it out, it seems just crap. But yet it's there somewhere, in all the bric-a-brac, collected into corners, words or phrases, caught and stored in moments when you didn't do the thing you should have, or did the thing you shouldn't have. The line was taut, the strain was promising. You stood your ground, but then the snap, the glimpse of silver vanishing downstream, the rod-grown slag. So, where do you expect to find poetry? In a newspaper? No. And yes, sometimes there is a poetry box stuck up in the corner of the page to hold the words in case they might escape, disturb the walls of prose outside, which at that very moment gets to grips with the serious issues and problems of our society. Who's divorcing whom, what Bono had for his tea, or whether or not what's-her-name will win the Kerry by-election. No piddling around with fancy imagery and how we might as humans be congenitally inclined to kill our neighbours, kill the planet, kill ourselves. That's poetry. This is prose, the stuff that tells us straight. The real world of prose to which the reader will return when his or her or its brief dalliance in the delicate garden of sweet poesy, i.e. here in the poetry box, has ended. Well, Nietzsche proved that 30 seconds is the max that most of us will stick with art, not least amid the mothball smell of words that don't immediately make sense and lines that arbitrarily end and never make it to the margins. That's enough for that. Let's see, the crossword. So where do you expect to find poetry? In a poetry book. The auguries are good. The lines don't reach the margin's edge. See above. The headings are obscure. There is a definite lack of sense and everything is very personal. Must be poetry. And furthermore, the book is put together by a bunch of poets. And they must know what poetry is, right? If they're any good as poets, they must be, if they're in the book. And sure enough, they put in lots and lots of their own stuff, with grainy photos of themselves in that familiar pose in which they face the camera, punching themselves. Or holding their faces up with their hands. While wearing all the while with all the poet smile that gives you to understand the muse is near. So do not fear, these are guaranteed to be top-notch poems that the cover says they are. These are the professionals after all. You know you're not being had, not being the victim of a sly attempt to steal your feelings while your intelligence isn't looking. But look at the price, hang on. Might pick it up later on, second hand. So, where do you expect to find poetry? At a poetry reading. Well, it's a poetry reading, and with live poets who declaim in that communicative monotone, aka the poetry voice that tries to invest words with an importance they would not possess. If you spoke to them in an ordinary way like this, do you know what I mean? And as a bonus, and at no extra cost, you're treated to some very long, some very convoluted introductions, 3 and 4, and several times again the length of the poem itself, along with all the usual personal and ultimately unchallengeable and therefore unverifiable explanations, qualifications, justifications, definitely poets. So high your expectations. So verily convinced are you that poems will be found here at this poetry reading, roaming unfenced fields at will, instead of being corralled in the poet's corner, see above, under the picture of the quill and the usual baldy graphic of the bard and ruffled whiskers. Oh, so very full are you of the expectation that you feel somehow a disappointment and a shame to see these poor, bedraggled creatures of the broken line reach out to you from underneath enormous smothering mounds of personal baggage, crying to be heard, desiring that their incoherent pain will be remembered. Only thing, this chair is very hard and there's a draft behind me. So, where do you expect to find poetry? At the open mic. Okay, but first you have to find the open mic. That transmigration of unquiet souls doomed to roam from pub to pub forever, chanting their interminable verse. The bouncer at the International tells you, no, I haven't seen them in months, some kind of row I believe. And then the barman down at Slattery says, not since before the room was needed for the lap dancers, and that was weeks ago, but thinks they might be down in Brogans. Brogan scratches their head and says, try the Jew. And after that you try out several gay bars on the off chance that what the general public think the poets might be true. But no, it seems that mostly poets are closet heterosexuals. Don't give up. Eventually you'll run them to ground in some back room or basement slated for change of ownership or renovation or demolition. And there they are, young poets, with not much of a clue, but trying to work towards something that might be poetry someday in the far distant future. And old poets, much wiser, experienced, full of years, with not much of a clue, but trying to work towards something that might be poetry someday in the far distant future. And you sit there and listen to some guy eating the mic and going on and on about, where do you expect to find poetry? Well, here, dickhead. And if you have to write about the writing of the poetry, then you must have nothing to write about. Still, good stuff, a lot of it better than your stuff. And for once these people seem to care about the audience and whether or not they're listening or dropping off to sleep. Well, that's a change. But is it poetry? On the late bus home, a Coca-Cola can is rattling across the aisle. You stop, ask it, tell me this, oh Coca-Cola can. Does such a thing as poetry exist? The can escapes, down the stairs, shouts. Maybe it does, but then again, maybe it doesn't. Infinite the wisdom of inanimate soul. Where do you expect to find poetry? In your kitchen. Well, okay, you're in the kitchen, place where life confronts us daily with straight questions, and you're filling up the dishwasher, and you're listening to the news, and you hear a woman telling how she had to leave her village, take her children and whatever chattels she could carry over mountainous terrain because they came in trucks the night before and took her husband and the other men away. But not enough away, she couldn't hear the shooting in the fields. And all through this her voice is calm, her broken English slow, her sorrow held back, trembling in her words the way you'd hold an injured bird. And yes, you think, this is the rod that bears the pull and strain of what is indescribable, of what is unimaginable. And no, you never thought to hear it here beside football and the weather report, or whether or not what's his name will run again for re-election. And you lay aside the sweeping brush and dustpan, sit and listen to her words that never saw the page, her words demanding they be written. And you know you'll have to write them, though you know she'll never read them. Maybe no one will. And even if you only catch the gaps between her words, it might be poetry.